Here's how to spot Etsy sewing pattern scams so that you don't waste your money. There's been a lot of conversation about scam product listings on Etsy. It's definitely been picking up steam over the past year, but I feel like it's gotten a lot worse over the past couple months, especially with the amount of AI-generated listings that are popping up on the platform. Now, of course, I am going to keep this super relevant to what knowledge I have, which would be sewing patterns. But I just wanted to take time to break down some of the tips on how I review an Etsy listing before I buy it, because you may see these cheap Etsy files, right? And their products, they're listed at $2, $3 for some crazy sewing pattern, but that's not really the true cost of what happens when you fall victim to one of these sewing pattern scams. So even though these products are really cheap, it's actually not truly representative of how much money you're losing. By example, you're going to spend time and resources printing out these sewing patterns, taping them together. You're going to use fabric, and you definitely don't want to be wasting fabric. So the true cost is much more than $2, and not to mention, it's frustrating, and who wants to give a thief money? Not me. So with all that being said, let's get into tip number one. Tip number one, always review the style lines. I'm actually going to be talking about two different ways that you can spot bad sewing patterns based off of product images, and there's kind of one tip that comes before that, and that is to review the style lines of a sewing pattern. So what I do when I am browsing Etsy is I am looking at the product files and comparing them to the line art drawing that is available from that product. And sometimes you can spot inconsistencies there, such as a waistband is different, or there's darts missing. Maybe the product photo has bust darts, but the line art has princess seams. I really recommend just trying to study the technical drawings compared to the product images, and that's usually where I can pick up like, hey, something's not right here. And there's a couple reasons of how this happens, of where the style lines don't match the product photos, and we'll get into that in just a second. But basically, you just want to look at all the design elements, compare and contrast, and see if they're really matching, especially across those product images. So again, this tip works in conjunction with tip number two, which is learning to spot AI-generated photos as well as stolen product photos. Really, the uptick of AI-generated photos has really been driving this conversation. I keep seeing it come up again and again, especially over in my Instagram comments or other TikTok creators. If you don't know how to spot an AI image, I definitely recommend learning how to train yourself, as simple as looking at a lot of AI-generated photos, especially the ones on Etsy. They kind of have this weird smoothing effect to them. They just kind of look like not a real photo. They look like they're something out of a fantasy movie or something. The skin will be really smoothed, or, you can always look at the hands. Sometimes AI have a really hard time generating hands and fingers, so I would just study those photos and see if you can find anything that looks unrealistic or really just kind of feels off. So after you've spotted a listing that is using an AI-generated image to promo their product, that's enough of a red flag for me that I won't use the sewing pattern, because again, the real sewing pattern isn't being used to generate these images. And that goes the same for stolen product photos. Now, if you are not a chronic online window shopper, or you are a recovering online window shopper, this may be a little bit more difficult for you to pick up on. When this happens, an Etsy seller is going to popular websites and stealing their product photos for popular products, and then using those to sell a digital sewing pattern. So definitely keep an eye out for AI-generated photos and stolen product photos, which leads me to tip number three. Tip number three, always review the store's other products. Now, typically when I open a product on Etsy, before I buy anything, I always like to go to their shop and look at their other items. Because if you are a person who maybe you can't identify AI-generated images, or maybe you can't tell that they're stealing their product photos, when you go to their main shop, you can see that there's a large discrepancy on their photos, just kind of looking like they weren't made by the same person. Now, sewing pattern companies do not always use the same model. They don't always shoot in the same location, but if you're seeing such a vast difference in image quality, image location, and maybe even the different amount of models being used, I feel like sometimes that's a really good indicator of whether they're selling legit products or not. Again, this one can be a little bit more difficult to pick up on. It really depends on how often you are online shopping, but I would always compare and contrast the other listings in their store to the particular product that you are thinking about purchasing. Tip number four, actually reading the reviews. I know what you're thinking, Jade, I don't really care if it's an AI generated photo. It has like 1 billion 5-star reviews. Stop. You need to actually read the reviews because sure, someone could be stealing photos, they could be using AI, and the pattern could definitely work. It could be exactly what you were looking for. Now, doesn't mean that they actually made it. They also could be stealing their sewing patterns. I have noticed on a lot of these AI generated shops, even the reviews seem to be really fake. I think it's really good to have a reminder of how the Etsy platform works. Once you purchase a product, you have a permanent notification within your account to leave that item a review. Now for sewing patterns, you can't really leave a review for a product if you haven't actually sewn it yet. But I've noticed in a lot of these AI listings, with the price point being so low, users seem to be more willing to leave a review before they've ever even sewn the product. So I've seen a ton of reviews that are 4 or 5 stars from people who are like, oh, I got the product, but I haven't sewn it yet. That's not useful for anyone. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend you actually read through the shop's reviews to make sure that you are not getting scammed. So those are my top 4 tips on how to avoid or how to spot potentially bad sewing patterns on the Etsy platform. This is not going away anytime soon, and I know that Etsy as a platform is under a lot of pressure to figure out how to deal with what's going on right now, but there's currently not a great solution to this problem, which means it gets put back on you and I as the consumer on the Etsy platform. So I hope these tips were helpful and that they keep you from wasting money on another bad sewing pattern. If you have any requests for any other topics or any other DIY projects, let me know down below and I will cover them for you. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.